The rain came sideways over Normandy that night. Thick, cold, slashing through the open doors of the C-47s as the green lights flickered on. Beneath the storm, the French countryside was nothing but blackness, cut by the orange pulse of distant flak and the trembling white of searchlights. Inside the plane, 30 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne stood shoulder to shoulder, faces ghost white under the red cabin glow, helmets rattling as the engines screamed. Corporal Daniel Red Mallory checked the safety on his M1A1 carbine for the 10th time, though he knew it by heart. He could taste cordite from the plane's exhaust. His gloves were slick with sweat. The man beside him, Private First Class Joe Pappas, had torn a photograph from his pocket. A smiling woman in a sunlit garden now smudged with grease. Pappas wasn't praying. He just stared at it as if the world beyond the clouds might never exist again. Then the intercom crackled. Captain Louis Bragg's voice. Calm, clipped, impossible. "Men," he said. "New orders. You are not to fire unless fired upon. Repeat, do not shoot. Not the French. Not the Germans. No one." The words fell like shrapnel. The plane went silent except for the droning propellers. Outside, tracer rounds tore upward through the rain, red and white like sparks from hell. Red Mallory's jaw tightened. He thought he hadn't heard right. Do not shoot? They were dropping into German-held territory, behind enemy lines, and their rifles might as well be broomsticks. But the order was real. Stamped from Eisenhower's own command net, pushed down through chaos, through miscommunication, through desperation. An order that would define one of the most misunderstood and haunting nights of the war. As the green light blinked on, the door slid open, and the wind roared like Judgment Day. The first jumpers vanished into the dark, one after another, silhouettes swallowed by storm and flak. Red Mallory leapt forth, counting the seconds between bodies. The blast of wind nearly tore the breath from his lungs. Rain struck like bullets. The jump light had gone green, but the sky was madness. The pilot flying too low, too fast. The aircraft already off course. The moment his chute snapped open, the world turned silent except for the pounding of rain on silk. Below him, somewhere beyond the darkness, was Sainte-Mère-Église, the small Norman town that had become a code name on briefing maps. A cluster of medieval streets the 82nd Airborne was tasked to secure before dawn. But now the wind dragged him west. Lightning revealed chaos. Chutes scattered for miles. Burning planes spiraling down. Tracer fire reaching for them like fingers. Mallory could hear men shouting through the night, their cries swallowed by the roar of engines. He landed hard in a flooded pasture, the shock biting through his knees. The canopy collapsed into the mud. Water surged into his boots. He tore the chute straps free, pressed low, scanning the hedgerows. The smell of wet earth and manure filled his lungs. His carbine was caked with mud, useless until he cleared it. He could hear distant shouts in German, sharp, disciplined, terrifyingly close. That was when he remembered the order. Do not shoot. It made no sense now, crouched in enemy territory, hearing boots on the road nearby. But orders were orders. Somewhere above this chaos, the generals had reasons. Intelligence no one on the ground could see. Maybe it was about civilians, maybe French resistance contacts, maybe they were walking into a trap. He stayed still. The boots passed. 3 soldiers, their rifles slung, cigarettes glowing faintly in the rain. Mallory watched, breath shallow until the last glow vanished. He moved toward the nearest hedgerow, whispering into the darkness. Pappas, you down here? No answer. Only the wind and the distant rumble of artillery from the beaches far away. He followed the narrow ditch line, step by step, until a whisper came from the dark. Red? It was Pappas, soaked, trembling, one lens of his goggles shattered. He still had the photograph in his breast pocket, now a smear of ink. Behind him, another man limped. Sergeant Hal Grady, their section leader, bleeding from a cut across his scalp. Grady's voice was low, angry. We're scattered all to hell. Half the sticks gone. Radio's busted. And Bragg's order, is that real? Mallory nodded. Came straight from the bird. Do not shoot. His words, Grady spat mud. Then we're dead. They crawled along a drainage ditch toward the faint glow of Sainte-Mère-Église. Along the way, they found more men. 2 from C Company, 1 from the 505th who had jumped from a different plane. All were disoriented, maps useless under the rain. They spoke in whispers, trading curses and guesses about why the order had been given. Some said the Allies feared hitting French civilians or friendly resistance. Others claimed Eisenhower wanted the first contact with civilians to be peaceful, a show of liberation. But the men knew better. In the dark, peace and war were the same shade of black. They reached a crossroads littered with wreckage, a glider torn open like a tin can, its nose buried in mud. A single paratrooper hung dead from a tree, his chute tangled in branches. Grady lowered his head. Christ. Mallory stepped closer, saw the patch on the man's shoulder. 82nd Airborne, same as them. He searched the body, found a map tube half buried. Inside, the paper was soaked, but legible enough to show the landing zones. They were miles off course, at least 6 miles west of the intended drop zone deep inside German patrol lines. As they crouched to plan their next move, headlights appeared down the road. A Kubelwagen approached, its engine sputtering, a pair of soldiers laughing inside. Grady hissed, "Cover!" They slid into the ditch, mud cold against their faces. The car stopped. The driver stepped out to relieve himself against the hedge. His cigarette's ember glowed red in the rain. Pappas lifted his carbine. His hand shook, finger curling around the trigger. Grady whispered, "Don't." The order hung in their minds again. Do not shoot, unless fired upon. But the German finished, zipped, turned, his eyes catching movement in the ditch. He froze. For an instant, time died. Then he reached for his pistol. Grady fired first, the one muffled shot through the rain. The German fell backward without a sound. The second soldier inside the car shouted, scrambled for his weapon, and Pappas fired, a reflex more than decision. The muzzle flash lit their faces like lightning. The second man slumped over the steering wheel. Smoke drifted upward, mingling with rain. Grady exhaled. So much for do not shoot. They pushed the bodies into the ditch, covered them with mud, and took the vehicle. Its engine coughed, then caught. The smell of gasoline filled the air. Pappas drove, eyes flicking between the road and the lifeless forms beside it. Mallory stared out the window, trying not to think. The road wound through hedgerows and small stone cottages. Occasionally they passed the blackened ruins of barns, the aftermath of artillery strikes. The sky was still alive with distant gunfire. When they reached the outskirts of Sainte-Mère-Église, the church bell rang once, a dull, hollow sound that froze them in place. They parked behind a crumbled wall. From there they could see the town square. German trucks, soldiers milling about, a few fires burning from earlier bombing runs. Civilians were nowhere in sight. Then as lightning flashed, Mallory saw something impossible. A paratrooper dangling from the church steeple, his chute tangled around the cross, body limp, swaying in the wind. Pappas whispered, "Jesus." It was Private John Steele of the 505th, one of the many who had jumped too early. Later the world would know his story. But for now, all Mallory saw was a man caught between heaven and hell, too high to save, too visible to hide. Grady's jaw set. "We can't help him, move." They crept along the narrow lanes, avoiding German patrols. The town was alive with chaos. Officers shouting, vehicles moving, gunfire erupting sporadically. Every sound echoed like thunder. When they finally reached the north edge of town, they met a small group of paratroopers, maybe 20 men, led by Captain Bragg himself, his uniform soaked, helmet dented. He looked at his men, eyes burning. "You heard the order. Do not shoot unless fired upon. We're here to secure, not destroy." Grady stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, they're all over the town. We open fire, we'll wake the whole division." Bragg shook his head. "That's the point. We need confusion, not war. The brass wants civilians alive, infrastructure intact. The beaches depend on it." Mallory could see the weight in Bragg's eyes, the conflict between duty and survival. But there was no choice. Orders were orders. They dug in at the edge of a small orchard overlooking the main road, watching as German convoys passed toward the coast. Rain softened to mist. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang again. Not for mass, but for invasion. Mallory cleaned his carbine, checked the bolt, felt the tremor in his hands. Around him, men muttered prayers, curses, or nothing at all. When dawn came, the sky glowed faintly pink over the hedgerows. Parachutes hung like ghosts in the trees. The Battle of Normandy had begun. And for the 82nd Airborne, trapped behind lines with an order that defied logic, the nightmare was only starting. The morning mist hung like smoke over Sainte-Mère-Église. The air smelled of rain, mud, and gunpowder. the ghostly perfume of invasion. Across the fields, the scattered silhouettes of parachutes fluttered from hedgerows and power lines. A cow lowed somewhere in the distance, the sound lonely and strange after the night's chaos. Captain Bragg stood at the edge of the orchard, scanning the town through his binoculars. His men crouched behind him, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. They had been scattered, shot at, soaked, and starved of clarity. Yet still that order lingered, like an echo that refused to die. Do not shoot. Bragg could almost hear the words replay in his skull, like the drone of the engines they'd jumped from hours earlier. It was not a request. It was command, delivered from high command channels and relayed through the fog of confusion. Somewhere between the beaches and the drop zones, someone had decided the 82nd Airborne would enter France as liberators, not killers. The brass believed the French people would rise up alongside them if the paratroopers showed restraint. But restraint, Bragg thought grimly, was a luxury. Through the mist, he saw them, German paratroopers from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, their gray coats dark with rain, moving down the road in small squads. They were young, boys really, but their discipline was unnerving. Every movement crisp, weapons at the ready. They were sweeping the outskirts of town, likely looking for the same scattered Americans who had landed off course. "Sir," Grady whispered beside him, "we could take them easy. They don't even know we're here." Bragg lowered his binoculars. His face was drawn tight. "No, hold fire. They're not to be engaged unless they fire first." Grady clenched his jaw but obeyed. The men watched in silence as the Germans passed, boots squelching in the mud, their breath visible in the morning chill. One looked up for a moment, eyes scanning the orchard. For a heartbeat it seemed he might raise his rifle, but he didn't. They moved on, disappearing into the fog. Bragg exhaled, a faint tremor in his breath. See, they don't want to fight either. Mallory wasn't so sure. He had seen the look in those German eyes, they're alert, calculating, not afraid. They knew the Americans were somewhere close. They were waiting for the first mistake. As the hours passed, more paratroopers stumbled into the orchard, mud-covered ghosts emerging from the hedgerows. By noon, Bragg's group had swollen to almost 60 men. They had no radio contact, no air cover, and only fragments of the original plan. Rumors spread among the men like fever. Some said the beaches had been wiped out. Others claimed the entire invasion had failed. No one knew the truth. They decided to move closer to Sainte-Mère-Église to secure the crossroads and wait for word. The town looked peaceful from a distance. Stone houses with shuttered windows, a church tower rising above the rooftops, smoke curling lazily from a few chimneys. But beneath that calm lay tension, every shadow a threat, every door a question. As they entered the first narrow street, Bragg raised his hand for silence. The cobblestones were slick under their boots. Somewhere ahead, a radio played faintly through an open window. A German broadcast, the voice monotonous and confident. Then, a door creaked. A woman stepped into view, gray hair, wrinkled hands clutching a basket of laundry. She froze when she saw them. 6 men in muddy jump gear, helmets low, rifles glinting. For a long moment, no one moved. Bragg lowered his weapon, raising a hand in greeting. "Madame, Americans." Her eyes widened. Disbelief, then relief, then tears. She dropped the basket, cloth spilling across the stones, and ran back inside, shouting, "Les Américains! Les Américains!" Within minutes, doors opened all along the street. Men, women, and children poured out, faces streaked with soot, eyes wide with gratitude and fear. Some carried bread, others bottles of cider, all trembling with a joy that felt too fragile to last. Mallory watched in silence as Bragg tried to calm them, whispering for quiet, for restraint. The Germans were still near, and the sound could bring death upon them all. But it was too late. From the end of the street came the roar of an engine. A German half-track turning the corner, a squad of soldiers perched on top. The crowd froze. The paratroopers ducked into doorways. For one impossible second, both sides simply stared at each other. The Germans stunned by the sight of Americans in their midst, the Americans paralyzed by the weight of their own orders. Then, the German officer raised his Luger. Bragg shouted, "Hold!" The gun fired. The woman with the laundry basket fell, a hole blooming crimson in her chest. The silence shattered. Grady opened fire first, his Thompson rattling like thunder. Mallory followed, the carbine kicking against his shoulder. Bullets screamed through the narrow street. Plaster exploded from the walls. Civilians scattered, screaming as the half-track's machine gun opened up, spraying the facades of ancient stone houses. Bragg dove for cover behind a trough, shouting, "Get them out of here! Move the civilians!" Pappas dragged two children into a doorway, shouting over the chaos. The town's joy had turned in seconds to terror. The Germans retreated under the sudden fury, their vehicle backing down the street, smoke trailing from its side. One paratrooper hurled a grenade. The explosion shattered windows and filled the air with dust. When it was over, the echoes of gunfire lingered in the narrow alleys like the ringing of church bells. The street was littered with broken glass and fallen shutters. The old woman lay still beside her laundry. Mallory knelt beside her, eyes hollow. Bragg stood motionless for a long time. Then he turned to his men. "They fired first," he said quietly, as if convincing himself. "We did what we had to." No one replied. The do-not-shoot order had died in the mud of Sainte-Mère-Église, and with it something in each of them had changed, a piece of restraint that could never return. That night they took positions around the church. The rain had stopped, replaced by a thin mist that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The bells hung silent now, their ropes frayed by shrapnel. Mallory and Pappas shared a foxhole beside a toppled stone wall. Pappas was quiet, eyes unfocused. The photograph in his pocket was almost destroyed and water-stained and torn. "You all right?" Mallory asked. Pappas nodded slowly. "She's gone now, Red, that woman today. Looked just like my ma. For a second I thought..." He stopped. "We came here to free them." "But what the hell does that even mean?" Mallory didn't answer. He stared out at the churchyard where a few bodies still lay covered by canvas. Liberation, he thought, was supposed to look cleaner than this. At dawn, they heard the low rumble of distant armor, tanks moving along the coastal road. Bragg gathered his remaining men. They were down to 45 now. Ammunition was scarce, rations gone, morale fading. But orders came from a runner, a mud-streaked corporal from another drop zone. The beaches were secure. The landings had succeeded. Reinforcements were pushing inland. The 82nd was to hold Sainte-Mère-Église at all costs. The men looked to Bragg, waiting for confirmation. He nodded once. "Then that's what we'll do." They spent the next hours fortifying the town, turning overturned wagons into barricades, setting up machine guns in upper windows, digging trenches across the crossroads. Civilians helped, silent and pale. By midday, the first counterattack came. German half-tracks rolled in from the west, machine guns blazing. Mortar shells whistled down, shattering the steeple's edge. Bragg's men returned fire, shouting across the din. Mallory crouched behind a stone wall, reloading. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the acrid stench of cordite. He could barely hear over the thunder of guns. Pappas was beside him, firing short bursts, face streaked with soot. "On your left," Grady shouted. A squad of Germans had flanked through an alley, rifles flashing. Mallory spun, fired twice, two figures dropped. Another bullet grazed his shoulder, ripping through fabric and skin. He felt the burn but kept firing. For an hour the battle raged through the town, house to house, room to room. Civilians cowered in cellars as bullets tore through walls. Finally, the Germans began to fall back, leaving bodies and burning vehicles behind. The Americans held, barely. When the smoke cleared, the town was a ruin. Bragg limped through the square, helmet gone, blood on his sleeve. He found Mallory crouched by the trough, staring at the broken statue of the Virgin Mary that had once stood before the church. "Hell of a way to make peace," Bragg muttered. Mallory didn't look up. "You still think we did right, sir?" Bragg hesitated. "I think we did what war makes us do. That's all anyone can say." He turned away, staring toward the horizon, the faint thunder of artillery still echoing from the beaches. The town had been liberated. But in the eyes of the men who'd fought for it, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, and the uneasy understanding that orders and morality rarely marched in the same direction. That night, the church bell rang once more, a single broken note in the wind. Mallory lay awake under the shattered roof of a farmhouse, watching the moonlight through the beams. He thought of the woman in the street, of steel still hanging from the steeple when they cut him down, of Bragg's haunted stare. The order had been clear, once. "Do not shoot." But the war had a way of making clarity rot into chaos. Somewhere beyond the town, tanks rumbled. The front was moving inland. The 82nd would move again soon, to Carentan, to the hedgerows, to more battles that would blur together until nothing remained but smoke and memory. Mallory closed his eyes. The rain began again, soft, steady, relentless. The fields south of Sainte-Mère-Église were drenched in morning fog. The air still carried the bitter smell of cordite and burning fuel. Paratroopers from the 82nd moved through the bocage, long hedged corridors of earth and thorns, a labyrinth carved by centuries of farming, but now turned into a killing ground. Red Mallory trudged behind Sergeant Grady, his uniform stiff with dried blood, his carbine slung low. Every few hundred yards they halted, listening for the rhythmic growl of panzers. The Germans were regrouping to the south, and the 82nd had orders to cut the road to Carentan before armored reinforcements could reach the beaches. But there were fewer of them now. The faces that had filled the C-47 2 nights ago were mostly gone, killed, captured, or simply vanished in the chaos of Normandy. The men called themselves the Ghosts of Sainte-Mère. They were exhausted, hungry, but they moved with grim purpose. Each hedgerow conquered was another inch toward survival. By midday, they reached a crossroads littered with burnt wagons and shattered helmets. The sign read Chef du Pont, a vital bridge crossing the Meurthe River. Bragg called a halt. He crouched beside a map spread across the hood of a jeep. The paper was smeared with mud torn at the edges. "Carentan's here," he said, tracing his finger along a jagged pencil line. 10 miles. Germans have armor dug in along this road and heavy positions near La Fière Bridge. Our job is to block any counterattack moving north from Carentan toward the beaches. Grady scowled. "And with what, sir? Half a platoon and 2 boxes of ammo?" Bragg looked up, eyes cold. "With guts. Same as always." Mallory caught Bragg's gaze. That same weary determination he'd seen in Sicily, in Italy, wherever the 82nd had been thrown first into the fire. The man had become more symbol than soldier now, a tired embodiment of command under impossible orders. "Move out," Bragg said. The march toward La Fière was silent except for the squelch of boots in mud. Crows drifted overhead, their calls echoing over the flooded plain. The Meurthe had overflowed its banks from the spring rains, turning fields into shallow lakes. Here and there bodies floated, American, German, even cattle, all tangled in reeds and wreckage. When they reached the bridge, they found it already under siege. Men from the 505th Parachute Infantry were pinned down behind stone walls, rifles braced on sandbags, faces pale under helmets, streaked with grime. Machine gun fire cracked across the water. Mortars thumped from somewhere beyond the tree line. Captain Roy Creek of the 505th looked up as Bragg approached. "About damn time. We've been holding this bridge since dawn. Every hour they send another wave." Bragg crouched beside him. "Any armor?" "Not yet," Creek said, "but we heard tracks on the far road. Could be half-tracks, could be tanks. We can't hold forever." Bragg studied the river, brown water churning beneath the bridge, smoke rising from the far embankment. He knew what came next. He didn't have to say it. "Red," he said quietly, turning to Mallory. "You still have that bazooka tube we picked up from the wreck?" Mallory nodded. "Only 2 rounds left." "That's 2 more than nothing." The German attack came at noon. It began with mortar fire, shrill, echoing whines that ended in fountains of mud and screams. The paratroopers pressed flat against the earth as shards of metal clattered around them. Then came the machine guns, precise, unrelenting, chewing through foliage and sandbags alike. Across the flooded plain, figures advanced, gray uniforms ghosting through the mist, rifles flashing in the sunlight. Bragg shouted, "Hold your fire until they're on the bridge." The orders spread along the line. Every man's breath slowed. Fingers tightened on triggers. The Germans reached the halfway point, maybe 20 of them running low, shouting to each other over the roar. Then Bragg raised his arm. "Now!" The bridge erupted in flame and thunder. Rifles, Thompson's bars, and the air filled with lead and smoke. Men fell into the water. Grenades arced through the air. Mallory saw one German lunge forward with a satchel charge only to vanish in a blast of fire. A half-track rolled into view beyond the far bank, its turret swiveling. "Mallory!" Grady shouted. "Now!" Mallory rose, heart hammering. He steadied the bazooka on the parapet, sighted through the haze. The round hissed, streaked across the bridge, and struck dead center. The explosion lifted the vehicle off its wheels. Flames gushed upward, black smoke curling into the sky. Cheers rose from the Americans, ragged and breathless, but the victory lasted seconds. Another round of mortars slammed into the position, shattering stone, tearing through sandbags. "Fall back," Bragg ordered. "To the second line!" They scrambled across the road, diving into a drainage ditch as dirt rained down. Mallory landed beside Pappas, ears ringing. Pappas shouted something, but Mallory couldn't hear. The world had become one long metallic hum. He tasted blood. His nose was bleeding. When his hearing returned, he caught fragments of Bragg's voice, somewhere up ahead. "We hold until dark, then we move south. Hold until dark." The phrase meant something different now. Less about mission, more about survival. By nightfall, the attacks had stopped. The bridge was a ruin of bodies and debris. Smoke drifted across the water in thick veils. Bragg gathered what was left of his force, some 37 men, half of them wounded. The 505th was holding its own sector, but both units were stretched thin. They needed to reach Carentan before dawn, to link with the 101st and seal the corridor. As they moved out, Mallory fell back beside Grady. The sergeant's face was gray with exhaustion. "You ever think," Grady muttered, "that we ain't meant to be heroes? Just the poor bastards who show up first and bleed for everyone else?" Mallory gave a half smile. "I stopped thinking a long time ago." The road ahead shimmered under moonlight lined with hedgerows that looked almost peaceful. But the peace was a lie. Every bend could hide a machine gun. Every shadow could hold death. They moved in silence. The only sound the distant rumble of the sea. Just before dawn, they reached the outskirts of Carentan, a small town caught between rivers and swamps, its narrow streets designed for anything but tanks. Bragg called the men into a ruined barn. "Listen close. The Krauts have the main road fortified. We'll flank through the marsh, come up by the rail yard, and hit them from behind. Quiet until I say otherwise." They nodded. The marsh was a nightmare. Waist-deep water, mud that sucked at their boots, insects whining in their ears. Every step felt like sinking into quicksand. Halfway through, Papa slipped, disappearing under. Mallory hauled him up, coughing, face covered in filth. "Hell of a war, huh?" Mallory said. Pappas laughed once, a hollow sound. "Yeah, hell's got better weather." When they finally reached the dry edge, dawn had broken. A gray, colorless light that made every ruin look ancient. Smoke rose from the far side of town where artillery had been pounding the German lines. They could hear shouting. Orders barked in German, boots running, engines revving. Bragg raised his hand. "Wait for the first volley from the beach artillery. That's our cue." The seconds stretched. Mallory could feel every heartbeat. Then, thunder. The horizon flashed as naval guns from the fleet miles away opened up, their shells screaming overhead. The ground trembled. "Go," Bragg shouted. They surged forward through the wrecked rail yard, rifles up, boots splashing in puddles. The Germans turned, stunned by the sudden assault. The first shots rang out, close, deafening. Mallory fired from the hip, saw a soldier spin and fall. Grady lobbed a grenade into a machine gun nest. It exploded, smoke and screams filling the air. The Americans poured through the gaps, shouting, pushing, relentless. For an hour, the fight raged through warehouses and alleys. When the shooting stopped, Carentan belonged to them. The men stumbled through the smoke, faces blackened with soot and victory. Bragg stood in the square, watching as a few civilians emerged from cellars, tentative, cautious, but smiling through their tears. For the first time since Normandy, there was laughter among the paratroopers. It was rough, short, unbelieving. Grady slapped Mallory's shoulder. "Looks like we made it." Mallory nodded, though his eyes drifted to the bodies along the street. German, American, indistinguishable under grime. "Yeah," he said softly. "Made it." That night, as rain began to fall again, the men sat beneath the ruined rail bridge, cleaning their weapons. Bragg walked among them quietly, checking on the wounded, offering what little comfort he could. He stopped beside Mallory. "You did good today," he said. Mallory shrugged. "We all did what we had to." Bragg looked out at the horizon. "Funny thing. Back at headquarters, they'll call this liberation. They'll never hear the orders, the confusion, the fear, just another name on a map. He paused. You remember that first order? The one that said not to shoot? Mallory nodded. Bragg smiled faintly. I think somewhere between Saint-Mer and here we found out what that really meant. Mallory frowned. What's that, sir? That we were supposed to remember what we were fighting for, even when we forgot how. Bragg walked away, his shadow blending into the mist. Later that night, Mallory sat alone, staring at his reflection in a puddle dark as ink. His face looked older, stranger, not the boy who'd jumped from the C-47. He reached into his pocket and found Pappas's photograph, which the younger man had given him to keep safe after the fight at La Fière. The ink was almost gone, but the outline of the woman's smile remained. He held it to the dim light, whispering, We're still here. In the distance, artillery flared again. Another front, another night of war. The road to Carentan had been won, but ahead lay Saint-Sauveur-Cherbourg and the long march toward the Rhine. The 82nd would keep moving, just as it always did, because for men like them there was no going back, only forward, through mud and memory and the echo of an order that had once seemed impossible. Do not shoot. It had begun as restraint. It ended as reminder, and it would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. The rain returned heavier than before, turning the Norman earth into a thick soup that swallowed boots and bodies alike. It was late June 1944, and the 82nd Airborne had pushed farther inland than any of them expected. Deeper into the hedgerows, where the war had slowed to a crawl, the enemy was no longer a shadow in the fog. They were everywhere, dug into hedges, camouflaged under leaves, snipers nesting in the upper floors of shattered farmhouses. The front no longer had a line. It was a maze of fields, ditches, and whispers. Red Mallory's squad moved through the mud with rifles at the ready, faces darkened with soot. Pappas was back beside him, the same nervous rhythm in his breathing, but quieter now, worn into acceptance. Feels like we've been here a year, he murmured. Mallory didn't answer. Ahead, Sergeant Grady crouched at the edge of a field, signaling them down. The air smelled of manure, gun oil, and death. A low rumble shook the distance. German armor again, prowling the next road. Behind them, Captain Bragg studied his map under a poncho, the paper soaked and torn. His voice was low when he spoke. They want us to push through Hill 192 by nightfall. Division Command says we're to clear the hedgerows east of Saint-Sauveur and make contact with the 90th Infantry. Grady looked up, incredulous. That hill's crawling with krauts. We'll get chewed to pieces, Bragg's jaw set. I didn't write the orders, Sergeant. For a moment, he just stared into the gray distance, raindrops streaking down his face. The last few weeks had carved deep lines around his eyes, lines of command, guilt, and exhaustion. Then he added quietly, and there's something else. Word from Course HQ. The standing orders changed. The men looked up. Bragg took a breath. No more restraint. No more waiting to be fired on. We're to engage anything that moves within the perimeter. Anything. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Mallory blinked slowly, feeling the words sink in. Do not shoot. The command that had haunted them since D-Day was gone. Now they were being told the opposite. Grady let out a hollow laugh. About damn time, he muttered. But no one joined him, because they all understood what this meant. When the order to hold fire was lifted, so were the last boundaries between survival and savagery. They advanced at dusk. The fields glowed with the faint light of burning haystacks. Smoke rolled low over the hedgerows, thick and sour. Every step was cautious, measured, the kind of movement learned by men who had survived too many ambushes. Mallory led the point, moving along the ditch line with his carbine tight against his shoulder. He could hear the buzz of flies, the creak of leather, the faraway groan of artillery. Suddenly, movement ahead. A figure darted across the path, small, hunched, wearing rags. Pappas raised his weapon. Contact, hold, Mallory hissed. He squinted through the drizzle. It wasn't a soldier. It was a boy, maybe 12, barefoot, carrying a sack of something. The child froze, eyes wide, then bolted into the hedgerow. Jesus, Pappas whispered. Thought it was a spotter. Bragg's voice came softly from behind them. Next time you don't think. You shoot. The words cut through Mallory like a blade. He turned. Sir, he was a kid. Bragg's eyes didn't waver. The Germans use kids. Messengers, scouts, decoys. We lose one more man because someone hesitates and it's on me. No one replied. The boy had vanished into the trees, the sound of his flight fading into the storm. Hours later, they reached the outskirts of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, another ruined town of stone walls and narrow streets. Another piece of ground that meant nothing except to the men dying for it. The smell hit first. Smoke, sewage, the iron tang of blood. Grady peered around the corner of a collapsed house. There, he said, pointing toward a row of windows. MG-42s, 2 nests, Bragg nodded. Take them out. No hesitation this time. Mallory and Pappas crawled forward through rubble, keeping low. When they reached 30 yards, Mallory pulled the pin on his last grenade and tossed it through the open window. The explosion blew glass and dust into the street. They stormed in right after, smoke, gunfire, screaming. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was done, the room was a ruin of plaster and blood. Pappas leaned against the wall, breathing hard. They didn't even have a chance. Mallory's hands shook as he reloaded. We're not giving them one anymore. Outside, Bragg's voice echoed. Clear the rest of the block. By midnight, Saint-Sauveur was theirs. The survivors huddled in the church, where candlelight flickered against walls pocked with bullet holes. Civilians lay in pews turned into stretchers. The rain dripped through the roof onto the flagstones. Bragg stood near the altar, radio handset pressed to his ear, listening to static. When he finally spoke, his tone was brittle. Division says we move again at dawn. Cherbourg's next, Grady groaned. They're bleeding us dry, sir. Bragg looked at him, not angry, not defiant, just hollow. That's what we're here for. Then, almost to himself, they changed the order because they needed killers again. Guess that's what we've become. Mallory watched him in silence. Something inside the captain was breaking, slowly, visibly, under the weight of the contradiction. He had spent the first week trying to stop his men from shooting. Now he was pushing them to kill. War, Mallory thought, had no mercy for men with conscience. The next morning, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled over the hedgerows like a false blessing. They moved north toward Cherbourg, cutting through abandoned villages and cratered fields. The sounds of battle grew louder with each mile, the steady percussion of artillery, the rattle of tank treads, the distant shouts of men dying. By noon, they reached a ridge overlooking the port. Smoke rose in thick black columns from the docks. The Germans were fighting to the last bunker. Bragg studied the harbor through his binoculars. We go down this slope across the rail line and hit the trenches by the waterfront. No more orders about restraint. You see, Gray, you drop it. Grady gave a grim nod. Understood. Mallory swallowed hard. The words felt wrong, but there was no room for doubt now. The only way home was forward. They descended into hell. The fight for Cherbourg was chaos, urban warfare at its worst. Buildings collapsed under artillery fire. Snipers picked off anyone who moved. The air was thick with dust and screams. Mallory fired until his shoulder bruised, until his mind went numb. He didn't count rounds anymore. He just pulled the trigger whenever a shadow moved. At one point, he kicked open a door and found a German medic crouched over a wounded comrade. The man raised his hands, shouting something in broken English. Nick Cheeson! Wounded. Mallory hesitated, and then Bragg's voice roared from behind him. Finish it! The shot echoed down the stairwell. The medic fell. Mallory lowered his rifle slowly. His stomach turned, bile burning his throat. Bragg stepped past him, face unreadable. We can't take prisoners. Not today. He kept moving. Mallory stared at the body for a long time, the silence roaring in his ears. Then he followed. When Cherbourg finally fell on June 26th, the 82nd's banners flew over a city reduced to ash and ruin. Ships smoldered in the harbor. The once busy streets were littered with wreckage and the dead. The men gathered on the quay, too tired to celebrate. Grady lit a cigarette with trembling hands. It's over, they say. At least this part. Mallory watched the smoke drift out to sea. Doesn't feel over. Bragg stood apart from them, staring at the water, his reflection broken by the ripples. He looked older than his years, the kind of old that never heals. He turned slowly, voice rough. You ever wonder what the first order meant, really? No one answered. Bragg continued. They told us not to shoot so we'd remember we were human. Then they told us to shoot everything so we'd survive. Somewhere between those two, we lost whatever we were supposed to be. He tossed his helmet into the surf, and I don't think we're getting it back. The tide took the helmet, carried it away. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the sea. That night, under a blood-red sunset, Mallory wrote in the small field diary he'd carried since Sicily, its pages wrinkled and stained. He wrote, "The order changed today. It's easier in a way. Easier not to think, but I keep seeing the woman in Saint Mare, the boy in the hedgerow, the medic's face. We were told once not to shoot. Now we do nothing else. Maybe the first order wasn't wrong. Maybe it was the last bit of mercy left in this whole goddamn war." He closed the book and slipped it into his pack. Above them, the guns of Cherbourg finally fell silent. But in the stillness that followed, the men of the 82nd found no peace, only the hollow echo of what they had become. The guns had stopped, but the echoes lingered. In the weeks after Cherbourg, the front rolled east, slow and brutal, through towns that no longer had names. The paratroopers of the 82nd moved like ghosts through what was left of Normandy, rebuilding, clearing, burying. Each sunrise came gray and every sunset was red. Red Mallory hadn't spoken much since the fall of Cherbourg. His carbine hung at his side now, rarely used. The war was still raging, in Saint-Lô, in Caen, in the fields of France, but for him it had turned inward. They bivouacked one night on a ridge above a ruined orchard. Below, the fields shimmered in moonlight, the same hedgerows they had bled through weeks before. The air was damp and still. Sergeant Grady sat on an overturned ammunition crate, smoking in silence. Pappas lay nearby, staring at the sky. His voice was a whisper. "You think the order's ever coming back?" Mallory looked up. "What order?" "The first one," Pappas said. "The one that said not to shoot, like, maybe one day we'll get told again to hold fire, to stop." Mallory didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant applause. "I think," he said finally, "that order was never for us. It was for the kind of men we used to be." The next morning, trucks arrived. Replacements, fresh-faced boys still smelling of stateside soap and ration coffee. They looked at the veterans like they were seeing ghosts. Bragg greeted them with a half-hearted grin. His voice, once sharp, was ragged now, like an old radio just barely working. "Welcome to France. Don't get too comfortable." One of the new sergeants asked if the fighting around Saint-Sauveur had really been as bad as the report said. Bragg just looked at him and said quietly, "Worse." Then he walked away. The replacements watched him go, whispering. Mallory caught their words. "That's Captain Bragg, the one from the do not shoot drop." The story had spread, twisted by rumor until it barely resembled truth. Some said Bragg had refused to fight. Others claimed he'd executed civilians. The truth, like the war itself, had dissolved in the fog of memory and myth. By July, the 82nd was pulled from the line for rest. They were sent to a collection of shattered farms near Utah Beach, a place that smelled of salt and rot, where the sea met the wreckage of invasion. For the first time in months, there was quiet. They bathed in the cold surf, shaved with dull razors, and ate hot meals that tasted of tin and grease. For a few days they remembered what it felt like to be human. Mallory sat on the dunes, watching the horizon. Ships moved like black shadows across the water, carrying new divisions toward the fight. The tide rolled in, carrying bits of debris, helmets, broken crates, the occasional unclaimed boot. Bragg sat beside him, eyes half closed. "You ever think about home?" he asked. Mallory nodded. "Every night," Bragg smiled faintly. "I tried to once, but I can't picture it anymore."
"All I see is the inside of that damn plane." They sat in silence.
The waves hissing softly. After a while, Bragg said, "You know, that first order might have saved more of us than it killed." Mallory glanced at him. "How do you figure?" "It made us hesitate," Bragg said. "And hesitation, that's when you remember who you are. The ones who never hesitated, they don't come back the same." He picked up a handful of sand, let it spill through his fingers. "Command doesn't understand that. To them, restraint is weakness. To me, it's the only thing that separates us from the dead." He looked out at the water again. "We followed both orders, the one that said not to shoot and the one that said kill everything. Neither one made sense. But between the two, maybe we found something like truth. Mallory didn't know what to say. A week later, new orders came down. The 82nd was to redeploy. Operation Market Garden, the Netherlands. Another jump, another battlefield. The men received the news in silence. No cheers, no groans, just the quiet understanding that war didn't stop. It only changed scenery. That night they gathered around a small fire, the sea wind whipping through the grass. Grady passed around a flask. Pappas hummed a tune under his breath, some half-remembered song from home. Bragg stood a little apart, staring into the dark. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. When we jump next, there won't be any orders like before. No rules about who we can or can't shoot. But I want you to remember, we started this war trying not to become monsters. Don't let it finish with us forgetting that. He looked each of them in the eye. We do what we have to. But we don't stop being who we are. You understand? They nodded. Some meant it. Some didn't, but all of them listened. The next morning, before dawn, Mallory found Bragg sitting alone on the beach, writing in a small notebook. The waves lapped close to his boots. "What are you writing?" Mallory asked. Bragg smiled without looking up. "A report they'll never read." He tore the page out, folded it, and handed it to Mallory. "For when I can't say it myself." Mallory hesitated. "Sir?" Bragg's eyes were tired. "Just keep it safe." 2 nights later, before the unit shipped north, Bragg walked down to the edge of the water and never came back. They found his helmet the next morning, lying on the sand beside his boots. No footprints leading away, only the tide smoothing everything clean. The official report said he drowned. Accident, exhaustion, one of many. But Mallory knew. The folded page stayed in his pocket for weeks before he opened it. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "If you ever read this, it means I've finally stopped hearing that first order echoing in my head. They told us not to shoot because they wanted us to see the world we were saving. I think I see it now. And I think I've done enough." Mallory folded it back and tucked it inside his helmet liner. He didn't tell the others. When the 82nd jumped into Holland that September, Mallory carried that note with him. He hit the ground hard, rolled through the mud, and came up firing. The order, whichever one it had been when, was gone now. The only rule left was survival. But in the brief quiet between bursts of gunfire, he sometimes heard Bragg's voice again. Calm, steady, impossible, do not shoot. It came not as command, but as memory. A reminder of a night in Normandy when they'd all still believed they were different from the men they fought. And sometimes, when Mallory had a clear shot at an enemy's back, he'd hesitate, just long enough to feel human again. Years later, after the war, he found himself walking through a museum in Washington. The air smelled of dust and polished wood. Behind glass, he saw photographs, grainy, black and white, the same kind the cameraman had taken in Normandy. There was one that stopped him cold. It showed a C-47 at night. Door-open paratroopers waiting to jump. One man near the back was turning toward the camera, half-shadowed, his face young and scared. Mallory leaned closer. He recognized himself. The caption read, 82nd Airborne, June 5, 1944, awaiting the order to jump. He stared at it for a long time until his reflection blurred into the glass. Then he whispered the words that had haunted him ever since. "We jumped before we were ready." He turned and walked away, the sound of distant rain echoing in his ears. That night he took out Bragg's note one last time. The paper was yellowed, edges brittle. He unfolded it carefully, read the words by the light of a single lamp. Then he folded it again, slipped it into the pages of a book of poetry his wife kept by the bed, a place where it would outlive him. He looked out the window. Outside, thunder rolled over the Potomac, low and steady, like the engines of an old plane. Mallory closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he could almost hear the voice again, carried by wind, rain, and memory. "Men, new orders. Do not shoot," he smiled faintly. "Understood, Captain."